No, they don't work. Well, they do work for the elite, because what austerity is, it is a process of looting. It's the way elites loot the economy. You see, capitalism no longer produces growth for the society. It's today a looting system. And there are two forms of looting. One happens when a country has large external debts that it is unable to service with its export earnings. This is particularly deadly if the external debts are not in that country's own currency, but in some foreign currency, such as dollar or euro. In this case, unable to service their debts, the International Monetary Fund, a representative of the New York banks, appears on the scene and tells the country, look, you'll be cut off from credit markets unless you sell off your state-owned assets, which may include your oil company, it may include your national forest. If you are Greece, it may include your protected islands, which have to go to real estate developers. So you have to sell off all public assets to private investors to raise the money to service your debt. And also, you've got to curtail domestic consumption and in order to free the resources to service your debt. And you also have to cut back on all sorts of government programs, such as medical care, education, pensions, public pensions, in order to have the money to pay your creditors. So that form of looting is widely used. It's associated with the International Monetary Fund. And what happens is the country loses control of its assets, which pass into foreign hands. And with the assets go the income flows from those assets. They also pass into foreign hands. So it is a process of impoverishing the country. Any country that has gone through an IMF restructuring has been impoverished. For example, in Greece and Portugal, both countries were brutally looted, and lost a large percentage of their young population, which simply had to leave the country in order to survive. The beneficiaries, of course, were the holders of the debt who benefited from being able to purchase the assets of these countries. Greece lost its municipal water systems, it lost its municipal ports, it lost its protected islands, it had terrible cutbacks in pensions and education. It forced a lot of Greek women into prostitution. The same thing happened in Portugal. So that is one form of looting. That's what happens when the country becomes too indebted to foreign creditors. The other form of looting is domestic privatization. A government comes into power and it says, we want to reward our friends. The way we reward our friends is we take a government-owned company and we privatize it, which means we turn it over to our friends at some low cost relative to its value. And therefore we can loot the country of its public assets and enrich a handful of our rich friends. And that's what your current government is doing. Your current government is looting the country in order to enrich its supporters, its rich friends. So when you have this type of a system operating, the only direction in which the country can go is down. So if it was the case that the left-wing government, which had some sense of obligation to ordinary people, if it ruined its opportunity by adopting the deadly politics of identity politics, then it discredited itself and placed the country into the hands of the people who will loot the country at the greatest expense of ordinary people in order to steal the assets of the country and put them in private hands. So all privatization is a mistake. It's a looting process, whether it's done by the IMF imposed austerity or by the domestic government in order to confiscate public assets. It's a process of de-industrialization. It's a process of putting Brazil back on the path to a third world country. Okay, the question you ask is whether the sale of Brazil's important assets can help the economic situation in Brazil. Can it bring jobs? Well, of course not. It costs jobs. It loses jobs. So when you sell off your important industrial manufacturing assets, you impoverish the country. You reduce opportunities within the country for employment. And the only effect is you get some temporary cash. What do you do with the cash? You sold an important business that produced income streams through time for a lump sum payment. What do you do with that money? You then turn it over to a foreign creditor that you owe money for. You use it to pay your balance of trade debts. What do you do with the money? You get nothing but a one-time lump sum payment, and it costs you an income stream that goes on for years and years and years and years. Exactly. So anyone who does that, anyone who adopts this policy is either an idiot, a mindless, incompetent idiot, or totally corrupt. There's no alternative answer. They're either an idiot or they're totally corrupt. And I suspect what you have there is corrupt government, enriching friends, or making deals with a protector like the United States. So the United States is a big fan of your current government. The United States hated Lulu and his successor, the woman, and worked against them and helped the frame-ups, helped the court cases. I regard your current president as an operative of Washington. He's essentially, he is essentially a tool for Washington and the New York banks. I do think the left-wing government had some social conscience. Not a whole lot, but some. I don't think any of the so-called right-wing governments do. And that's true in the United States. Trump seems to be an exception in the sense that he said he wanted to bring the jobs home that the global corporations had sent abroad. And he said he wanted to make peace with Russia so that we could stop these dangerous confrontations and high level of military spending. But he found that the establishment is too strong for him. He's been unable to prevail. In fact, he's been forced into more antagonistic positions with regard to both Russia and China. So the prospect of some conflict is higher now than it was during the Cold War period, when we had the so-called Soviet threat. And today it's the threat of American hegemony. You see, one reason the economists and the intellectuals support austerity is because it's the policy. And both economists and intellectuals are dependent on approval of elites, because that's where their grants come from. Many of them are publicly supported. That's where their consultancies come from. If you're an economist and you want to be a consultant to a bank or a corporation, you have to go along with whatever the policy of that bank and corporation is. And since that policy is austerity, you have to go along with it or you become dispensable. And so what you basically have in almost every country is a purchased intellectual class. There aren't any more independent intellectuals. The old Marxists are long gone. The labor unions are so weak they can't do anything. In the United States, the labor unions were destroyed when the manufacturing jobs were moved offshore. So it's easy to see why economists and intellectuals go along with policy. See, here even the left wing even supports wars. So the old left, bread and peace, that left is gone. That's the function of identity politics. It's used by the elites to separate the population, to split the population up and turn the various groups against one another. That way, there can be no unity against the ruling elite. So the ruling elite is not confronted with a people any longer. The people are atomized, they're divided, they're divided by race, by gender, by sexual preference. And so you have that type of situation where feminists are teaching hate of heterosexual males. Blacks are taught hate of white people. Transgendered and homosexuals are taught hate of straights. In the United States today, we have a big fight going on between feminists and transgender. The feminists claim that a woman is a woman, and the transgendered claim, no, she's not. And so when you have a population that is split into warring tribes, which is what I think you now have in Brazil, certainly have it here. In Europe, it's being achieved through immigration. They bring in all of these people from the Middle East and Africa who aren't French, who aren't German, who aren't British. And that then causes internal dissension. And so it gives more freedom to those who rule, because how do you hold them accountable? You're too busy fighting each other to hold the government accountable. So identity politics has greatly strengthened whatever the ruling elite is. Whoever is in power, they are far stronger than ever before because the people are too split to be able to unite to hold them accountable. So what you're witnessing is the complete destruction of accountable government. This is just as true in so-called democracies as it is in dictatorships. In fact, I would say it's more true in democracies. You see, it's no longer a country, it's a Tower of Babel. Supply-side economics dealt with a unique phenomenon. It was a situation in the United States where the marginal rate of taxation on income from both work and investment was so high that there was very little incentive to increase production or to increase work time to meet rising demand. And since the aggregate demand was growing more rapidly than aggregate supply because of these disincentive effects of the high taxation, we started having worsening Phillips curve trade-offs. You could no longer pay for economic growth with a low or moderate rate of inflation. You had to pay a higher and higher rate of inflation for each extra increment in economic growth. And so we reached a situation where the prices were rising faster than output, than real output. And so that gave an opportunity for supply side economics to step in and point out that the high tax rates were restraining the shift of the aggregate supply schedule, that the disincentive effects was preventing an increase in production sufficient to absorb the increase in demand from the government's deficits or from the Federal Reserve's money and credit expansion. And therefore, we had worsening Phillips curve trade-offs. That's what supply side economics addressed. Now, you may have that situation in Brazil with your high taxes and high regulations, but your other problems are even more fundamental. You're being looted. You're being looted. That's what privatization does. It's a looting mechanism. It's an indication that capitalism can no longer produce output. It's an indication that the banking system no longer finances real investment in productive capability. Instead, it finances buyouts, takeovers. It finances the purchases of existing assets, of existing financial assets. So the banking system no longer supports the growth in real income. It's just used as a way of buying existing assets, real or financial. So when you have that type of situation, supply side economics can't help you. So what advice can I give a government that is engaging in privatization in order to loot? I can say, stop looting. Stop looting your own country. Stop de-industrializing. Stop giving away the roads that take you to the first world. When you give away the roads that go to the first world, then you have to go back to the third world. You've already got large numbers of poor and unemployed people. You've got these people assaulting the Amazon rainforest. We have no idea of what the ecological effects of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest would be. It would be horrendous. You can see the pressure on resources from a policy that is impoverishing the country. So you've got to stop privatizing. You need to renationalize everything you privatized. That's what they have to do. Otherwise, the country's lost. You cannot have a successful economy when you are owned by foreigners and or the top 1%. You have to understand that the United States has done much the same thing. It didn't allow the Chinese to buy Apple, but it allowed Apple to take all the jobs to China and give them to Chinese and to bring the products, the products made in China back to the United States to sell. You know, the greatest part of the American trade deficit consists of the offshored production of Apple, Levi, Nike, all the companies that move their production to Asia. This is why our trade deficit is so large. because when you bring the offshore production back into the country, it counts as an import. You know, all governments are heavily indebted, except Russia, and I think China. Now, if you have to be indebted, you want to be sure that your debt is in your own currency. If your debt, we're talking about the public debt, the national debt, the bonds of the government. If the bonds of the government are in its own currency, it can print the money to redeem the bonds. But if the country's debt is in dollars or euros, and it doesn't have the foreign earnings sufficient to service the foreign currency loans, then is when it's looted. That's what happened to Greece, to Portugal. Some years ago, you may remember the Brady bonds in Mexico. The Mexicans borrowed in dollars because the banks said, oh, look, trust us, the New York banks. If you borrow in dollars, you have a lower interest rate than if you borrow in pesos. So the loan's cheaper for you to borrow in dollars. Well, this was a trick. The New York banks tricked the stupid Mexican government, got them to borrow in dollars. Their export earnings couldn't service the loans. And so Mexico had to default. And to prevent them defaulting, the American Treasury Secretary, Nicholas Brady, created Brady bonds, which amounted to a write-down of the Mexican debt to a level that the government could service. So they wrote down maybe half the value of the debt, and Mexico was able to get through it. So if Brazil's debt is in its own currency, then that's not a problem. They can print the real to redeem the bond. If it's in a foreign currency, it's a problem. The main problem with debt isn't the government's, unless it's in foreign currencies. It's the private debts. It's the corporate debts. In the United States, the population is so indebted that it has no discretionary income with which to drive aggregate demand. So the country can't grow for that reason, because debt service absorbs their income. They have a mortgage payment, they have a car payment, they have credit card debt, they have student loan debt. By the time they service their debt and buy their food, they've got nothing left. Businesses have not helped the GDP growth because they've used their profits to buy back their own stocks. They're decapitalizing the companies, because when they buy back their own stock, it pushes up the stock price, and the executives say, oh, look at our performance. We have a rising stock price. And then they claim all these multi-million-dollar bonuses. So there's no business investment to drive the economy. So the United States is now more into looting, because that's the only place it can get any money. So it's going to loot Brazil, just as it's attempted to loot Venezuela, just as the EU looted Greece and Portugal. You see, the EU's even turned on itself. The northern countries, Germany, the Netherlands, they now loot the poorer southern countries. Once you give up your currency, you're dead meat. And now in the United States, because of the coronavirus, the government has issued even more debt. Or let's put it differently, more money. Not the small businesses that will never return, not the people who are unemployed, but to bail out Boeing. So it's not a good situation anywhere, because all the countries have neoliberal economics, even Russia. I've tried to explain to the Russian government that neoliberal economics will wreck them, will ruin them. The same with China. But you see, they sent their economists to America to learn. And so they went to Harvard and Yale, and they learned neoliberal economics. So they go home. They say, well, this works in America, so it must work here. Of course, it doesn't work here. You see, all of the, well, let's put it this way, almost all of the growth in income and wealth in the United States for the last 30 years have gone to the top 2 or 3%. The rest of the people have experienced a decline in real income. Yeah, the middle class is being wiped out. And the students who went to university and took student debts in order to get middle class jobs, the jobs aren't there for them. But the debts are. They're there, and so they cannot afford an independent existence. You have a large percentage of young Americans who have to go back home to live with their parents or to live with grandparents because they can't earn enough to support an independent existence. So we've caught up with Brazil. If you simply, if the money increase goes into financial assets, which is done in the United States, you simply drive up stock and bond prices. And that's why we haven't had the hyperinflation that economists predicted. You know, we've had QE now going on, what, for 12 years. And now we've just had a huge new dose of it. But we don't see raging consumer prices, but we see stock prices that are unrealistic. We see very high price earnings ratios. We see bond prices so high that the interest rate is zero. So how can you have zero interest rates when you have massive debt and no savings? There are no savings, massive debt and zero interest rates. It doesn't make any economic sense. And the explanation is that the trillions of dollars that the Federal Reserve created went into the prices of financial assets, stocks and bonds, and the various forms of derivatives and so on. So it's a form of a speculation, and it produces a situation where the real economy has no resemblance to the high stock prices. Because high stock prices suggest very high growth, great income prospects, growth of earnings, but there's no growth in the economy to justify that. So that is the price of creating money to keep afloat financial institutions that have made extremely bad decisions. And so when you do that, yes, up goes you get inflation of stock prices, not in the general economy. Or very little of it finds its way into the general economy because the people dealing in stocks want it there. That pushes it up. They're richer tomorrow than they were yesterday.